Dear Renée, dear family, dear colleagues, dear friends of Renée, welcome to this farewell lecture by Professor Renée van der Vall, Caring for Contemporary Art, Reflections on Ethics and Aesthetics in Precarious Times. We have come together today to celebrate Renée and her academic work and to put her in the spotlight. It's amazing, but you, Renée, worked at our university even before our faculty was formally set up. It's amazing, but true. You started working in Maastricht at the Faculty of Algemene Wetenschappen, General Sciences, in 1993. This was 1 year before our Faculty of Cultuurwetenschappen, the predecessor of our current Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, was set up. And before you, Renée, came to FASOS, you already had a very interesting parcours behind you. You studied sociology and philosophy at the University of Amsterdam. You then were awarded your PhD in philosophy with cum laude, one always has to mention that, by the same university. In your PhD, you engaged with the work of the painter Barnett Newman and provided a philosophical interpretation of his work. And it is this PhD that sparked your interest in the issue of conservation and restoration of art. But the focus on art from a philosophical perspective was there already before then. Already in your MA thesis, you examined Hegel's philosophy of art. You then broadened this interest throughout your career to technological forms of arts and visual culture. To just give one example of this, you were principal applicant and project leader of the EU-funded research program Transformations in Perception and Participation Digital Games. You did this and you worked together with many different people, and many of them are here today throughout your career. You did this particular project together with Jan Simmons from the Universiteit of Amsterdam and Jo Wachelder and Jacques Post, who are of course both colleagues of ours. Now I will silently turn pages. You also led 2 NVO projects that then focused on your interest that you're talking about today, also on the conservation of art, and you were principal applicant and project coordinator of an innovative training network on new approaches in the conservation of contemporary art. This focus on these very inspiring topics led to numerous publications, many of them together with others, for example, Vivian van Sace. To just give one example of the beautiful publications by Renée, just the title, of course I can't read it to you today, The Devil and the Details, the Ontology of Contemporary Art in Conservation, Theory and Practice. What you see here, and you see that especially also in the Dutch titles, is really a passion for extremely beautiful and philosophical titles. When preparing for this talk, and now we come to the less formal bit of this talk, I asked you in the audience to characterize Renée with one word. And the word we came up with is dedication. You have demonstrated this not only in the context of the numerous publications that you engaged in as a philosopher, but also, and that's really important, in relation to the teaching and thesis and PhD supervision, and also in managerial terms. You have coordinated and tutored courses on bachelor's and master's level. You were directors of studies of the MA Media Culture. You have supervised and co-supervised many PhD candidates on a large range of topics, reaching from digital dance to the rehashing and remixing of music. Your dedication was also recognized and rewarded. You were appointed as extraordinary professor and then as full professor. This trait was also very visible in how you filled your role as head of department of the Department of Literature and Art, which you did for 8 years. This was also, of course, very visible in how you implemented the role of the head of research program of arts, media, and culture. I also thought of another term that is closely linked, and it is a term that comes up also today in your talk, and that, it might not be a surprise, is care. care for your work and care for others. I've worked with you, and it was really apparent that you care for what you do and for the others that you work with. Dear Renée, I've talked enough. The floor is now to you. I'm very much looking forward to your reflections on ethics and aesthetics in precarious times. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine, for these lovely words. Okay, yeah. See if this works. My glasses. Yeah. Dear Dean, dear Christine, dear colleagues, dear students, dear family, dear friends. In July and September last year, I had the pleasure of participating in a small brainstorm group about the restoration of Labia virginica grandiflora, a work from 1968 in the collection of the Bonnefante Museum. Labia was created by the Dutch artist Ferdi Tagiri, who lived from 1927 to 1968. It is one of a series called horti-sculptures, brightly colored plants like forms made of various kinds of fabrics. Bonnefante Museum owns 4 of these horti-sculptures, plus the large damsel dragonfly. All of the 4 horti-sculptures, and you see some of them with Labia in the middle on this photograph of Verdi, all of the 4 horti-sculptures that Bonnefante Museum owns need cleaning, repair and maintenance. But Labia has more problems than the other sculptures. Not only is the fabric discolored, it's also worn and even torn at several places, in particular at the seams where it is attached to the metal frame. The form and the volume of the leaves have changed. The leaves are hanging rather than pointing upwards or sideways. The electric lights do not work anymore. As a short video on the Bonnefante Museum's website explains, the works have to regain their playfulness and vibrancy, and this is particularly the case for Labia. Such meetings have always been precious to me. Being involved in conservation questions has been a continuous education of attention. I've never learned as much about works of art as when listening to conservator restorers, and so it was this time. Walking around the Labia with group members who asked all kinds of questions like, what is more important for the vitality of the work? The colors of the or the posture of the arms? Were the Christmas lights white or colored? Who did actually the stitching of the seams? Was it the artist or her assistants? Is it a standalone sculpture or part of a group? All these questions greatly intensified my perception and appreciation of the work. As if wondering what the work should look like is a kind of reenactment of its making, getting in touch with the work from the inside out. Moreover, there was something refreshingly unzeitgemäß, say out of sync with the times, in making this work, almost 55 years old, object of such attentive scrutiny, outside any exhibition agenda, outside what is currently hot and trending. Of course, there is a wider movement of reviving interest in forgotten or neglected female artists. But even then, why choose this so notoriously difficult to restore object? There have been restoration plans since the 1990s, which were never carried out. Why this work? Why now? What is it, if it isn't an act of love, an act of care? I have been very fortunate to spend my entire professional life reading, thinking, writing and teaching about what was dear to me, contemporary art. How to look at it, how to understand it, and not in the last place, how to think about its conservation. But now, at the end of my university trajectory, in these increasingly worrying times, the question arises, what could it all mean in a larger scheme of things? Contemporary art is but a very tiny, very specialized cultural niche, and its conservation is again an almost invisible aspect of its existence. Is there something that I have learned, something the field has learned, that might contribute to facing the problems the wider world has to deal with? And if I look back at some of the conservation conferences and workshops of 2022, I know I'm not the only one asking these questions. This lecture is heavily indebted to the reflections of Glenn Wharton, Pip Lawrenson, Jill Sterrett, Helia Marsal, and many others in these meetings. And I hope to add a tiny step to their thoughts. Precarious times. As my guide to say something about these precarious times, I would like to quote the following words by Anna Lowenhaupt-Tsing that eloquently summarize why the troubles of the world seem to have to reach a point of no return. We hear, I quote, about precarity in the news every day. People lose their jobs or get angry because they never had them. Gorillas and river porpoises hover at the edge of extinction. Rising seas swamp whole Pacific islands. But most of the time we imagine such precarity to be an exception to how the world works. It is what drops out of the system. What if, as I'm suggesting, says Tsing, precarity is the condition of our time? Or to put it in another way, what if our time is ripe for sensing precarity? End of quote. Climate change, pollution and massive extinction of species, increasing differences between rich and poor and north and south, dislocation of many millions of people by wars, hunger and natural disasters, we have arrived at a point in time in which it becomes obvious that these are not unfortunate side effects of a globalized economy that might be solved in the future if we all do our very best. They are systematic for the capitalist organization of production and consumption that acknowledges no limits in turning humans and non-humans in resources for investment and exploitation, and that now threatens the future of life on Earth. And there might be no happy ending. As Tsing writes, we can no longer rely on the stories of modernization of progress that promised a better future for all. We have to do without what she calls the handrails of stories that tell where everyone is going and also why. End of quote. But then, Tsing warns us, we also shouldn't. Stories of progress and modernization exclude. They tell us about those parts of the present that might lead to the future, and they leave out what doesn't. The leftovers that drop out of history. They form the unacknowledged rest of now, which was the title of an exhibition by the Indian artist group Rax Media Collective for the Manifesta exhibition of 2007, which I discussed in my inaugural lecture 12 years ago. The abandoned factories, the deserted bauxite pits, the deforested landscapes, evicted tenants or dislocated migrant workers that stay behind when, as Rax writes, the breathless pursuit of tomorrow's promised riches moves its focus elsewhere. Although it is almost impossible not to think in the categories of modernization and progress, Tsing notes, we need to develop another imaginative framework, a framework that allows us to look around rather than ahead. And I quote, "Progress is a forward march, drawing other kinds of time into its rhythms. Without that driving beat, we might notice other temporal patterns. Each living thing remakes the world through seasonal pulses of growth, lifetime reproductive patterns, and geographies of expansion. The curiosity I advocate follows such multiple temporalities, revitalizing description and imagination. These livelihoods make worlds too, and they show us to look around rather than ahead." End of quote. Tsing looks for hope, for stories of what she calls collaborative survival in the cracks, the patches of ruined landscape where uprooted species, human and non-human, meet, where a rare mushroom flourishes and provides a living for a polyphonic assemblage of beings. She advocates an art of noticing that appreciates the multiple temporal rhythms and trajectories of such assemblages. In this lecture, I will speculate not so much about cracks, but about niches, these unzeitgemäße spaces of perpetuation and care, the term is by Tatja Scholte, that have not yet been completely colonized by the logic of progress. And I will try to foreground the resilience of preciousness against the forces of precarity. The guiding concept in my speculation is the notion of care. I'm not so naive to think that changing concepts will change the world. That requires dedicated activism. I'm also not so naive to think that care alone is sufficient to understand human and more than human reality. Nor that care is this innocent, feel-good panacea for the destructions of today's global capitalism. As feminist care theorists have pointed out, real-life care arrangements are full of inequality and exploitation along the lines of class, gender, and race. But I do think with them that it is important to rethink the basic notions that structure our understanding of how we relate to our surroundings. And I do think that care may open up an alternative, hopefully connecting people rather than dividing them. In a way, everything that makes the care perspective in ethics distinctive is present in the often quoted words, we already saw them this morning, of Joan Tronto and Berenice Fisher. On the most general level, we suggest that caring be viewed as a species activity that includes everything that we do to maintain, continue and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. That world includes our bodies, ourselves, and our environment, all of which we seek to interweave in a complex, life-sustaining web. So care is not something that an inherently isolated and egoistic individual needs to be forced or convinced to do through considerations of self-interest or duty. It comes natural to us because we are all involved in and dependent on this life-sustaining web of caring and being cared for. Science and technology scholars and post-humanist theorists like Annemarie Mol, Ingo Moser and Jeanette Pauls and Marie Puig de la Bella Casa have included technological artifacts and non-human nature to this web of dependencies. Mol, Moser and Pauls comment how activities like cooking, washing, building, nursing, in spite of being central to daily life, have never received much scholarly attention until recently. But foregrounding care is much more than just placing an hitherto invisible domain of activity in the spotlight. It implies a shift of values that ultimately is political as well. For them, care signifies not only a domain, but also a mode, a style, a way of working to be found in all spheres of life. They talk about the logic of care. And I quote, its kindness, its effectiveness, its tenacity and its strength, end of quote, which needs to be salvaged against erosion, for instance by rules and regulations that are alien to them. Maria Puig de la Bella Casa, also often quoted this morning, defines care as a generic doing of ontological significance, as a species activity with ethical, social, political, and cultural implications, referring to the words of Trondheim and Fischer, already quoted before. And Joke Brouwer and Sjoerd van Tuinen write in the introduction to their volume, equally referring to Trondheim, "We are entering an era of a generalized ecology which foregrounds the inter-implications between people and things, or even between things, as much as those between people. Our next task in thinking is to finally pay equal attention to our habits and habitats. To mind is to care. Care provides a different foundation for modernity, one characterized less by new beginnings or in opposition to nature or the past, than by the humble and curious curation, cura means care, of what already and or still exists." So, although some scholars stay close to empirical examples of care and others think far more speculatively about the future of life on Earth, for many of them care promises an alternative way of thinking, an approach that can be used to criticize and hopefully replace the individualistic, competitive, and exploitative logic of global capitalism. As this speculative thinking goes beyond ethics in a narrow sense, I will call it care thinking. So what does it mean to think, to rethink, conservation of contemporary art in terms of care? What does it exemplify in terms of care thinking? I will illustrate this with an example. As my research on labia is still in progress, I will use an older case study, which some of you may already have seen before. These are 2 SBMK platform meetings that I have observed. SBMK, or Foundation for the Conservation of Modern Art, is an organization supported and financed by a great number of Dutch art museums. Next to platform meetings, SBMK organizes special thematic days and research projects on topics such as plastics, photography, and digital art. Platform meetings, in particular, are usually organized when a member of SBMK, for instance a conservator of one of the associated museums, proposes to discuss a difficult case from the museum's collection. The SBMK coordinator and core platform members invite experts, as well as participants from the network, like conservators from other museums with comparable works in the collection. At least 2 meetings are held following a protocol rooted in the SBMK decision-making model. The object discussed in the 2 platform meetings I observed was Joost Konijn's houtauto, wood car, which is in the collection of Central Museum Utrecht. With this car, Joost Konijn traveled around in Central and Eastern Europe in the autumn of 2001. There is a video film made of the journey, which always needs to be shown together with the car and the other way around. The car is a complete Citroën DS, but its original body was replaced by wood panels, and during the journey it ran on a wood-burning fueling system added by the artist, so it ran on wood. The traditional DS engineering determines much of the conservation problem. The car cannot be moved without the engine running, because the wheels will only move when the coachwork is lifted by a hydraulic system, and for this the engine has to be switched on. So the car can, for instance, not just be pushed to be moved. And it needs to move, for instance, into and out of the transportation trucks when it is on loan, and in and out, into and out of the exhibition venue. This is problematic because of the maintenance of the motor, which requires that the car has to be driven around at least twice a year to remain in the proper condition. Because of the exhaust fumes when the car leaves an enclosed exhibition space. And because of the fact that having an object with inflammable fluids in your storage room is not very safe. Therefore, the main question for the SBMK platform meeting and the discussions was, should future conservation of houtauto include its functioning as a car? There were two meetings organized in November 2015 in the external storage room of the Central Museum, and a second meeting in August 2016 in Museum de Halle Den Haag, Haarlem, where houtauto was then exhibited. So again, how do these discussions exemplify characteristics of care thinking? I will answer this question in 7 steps. All boiling down to the idea that care thinking is a thinking from within. Art conservation traditionally focuses on the protection of the original materials of which artworks have been made, and on the safeguarding of the maker's intentions. Contemporary art has made this focus problematic, for instance by its use of degradable materials, or of media technologies that become obsolete rapidly. Often, in the case of site-related installations, for instance, the work is even meant to change from one site to another, and sometimes it's even meant to disappear. So rather than staying the same, often a work has to change in order to survive. In a care-oriented perspective, this means that conservation may still imply protection or preservation of the original, but then as part of a more encompassing approach, aiming, and I quote, at practices, relationships, and experiences that contribute to and constitute to a flourishing existence. For houtauto, it was already the question what state should be protected. Already before the acquisition by Central Museum, Konijn had disconnected the wood-burning mechanism so that the car could be powered by gasoline. So the question came up, should the car be returned to the previous state, the state with the wood burner connected? But preservation was not the primary objective for the meetings. After the journey, the work was turned into an installation, consisting of a video film and a car. The car became a prop for the film, which made its driving function merely instrumental. So the discussions in the platform meetings were not so much about how to keep houtauto in a pristine state, but rather about how to make its future in Central Museum sustainable in the long run. Important about care ethics and care thinking is that these are relational approaches. Rather than taking individual autonomy as a starting point and a principle, it emphasizes the mutual dependency of people and even of all individual entities and beings as caring and being cared for. Both people and artworks derive their existence and their meanings from the relational webs they are part of and that sustain them. The importance of such relational webs was already apparent during the journey of Joost Konijn. As Konijn was operating outside the usual support system of highways and gasoline stations, he was depending on the assistance of the people he met along the way in order to keep the car moving. After the acquisition by Central Museum, houtauto has 2 identities. It is a car and it is an artwork. Again, both these identities are sustained by relational webs, which partly coincide but also partly diverge. Caring for houtauto as a car included driving it twice a year for the maintenance of the engine. Rob, filmmaker and technical assistant for the houtauto, came over to drive the car. He was also a DS enthusiast, a mechanic. He knew everything about the motors. He came also over when the car had to travel for a loan. And driving the car was a spectacular event and a real adventure, but also quite laborious and risky. Hence the question whether the car should continue to drive. Or maybe might it be transported in another way? In the same way you do with big bronze sculptures. For instance, on a tailor-made trolley. So more than on conserving an object, the deliberations focused on identifying possible identities for houtauto, weighing the pros and cons of various scenarios for desirable futures. And each scenario required a different constellation of equipment, skills and people, networks of care or assemblages of care. We heard Annette Dekker in the afternoon about this. Where the current scenario included, for instance, Rob's coming over to drive the car, for the alternative scenario, mention was made of a big trolley with wheels folding in and out, and also drivers strong enough to steer the car the last few meters without power steering or brakes. Although the second option, the trolley option, seemed the most viable, there was a niche. Houtauto is popular with old-timer societies, and it has been frequently asked for loan for old-timer events. So because of this other network, its identity as a car was not that easily discarded, and it kept coming up in the discussion that it might drive again in the future. Care ethics and care thinking are first and foremost about situated practices. Rather than theoretically working out general ethical rules and principles, and subsequently applying them to practice, it starts from the ethical dimensions of how people practice care in concrete, empirical situations, which are always to some extent unique. In the discussions about the houtauto, the term ethics was mentioned only once. Nevertheless, conservation ethical considerations were present throughout the discussion, but not in terms of explicit rules, principles, and values, but rather implicitly, as part of a rather specific and practical question or exchange. We could replace the fragile bottom of the car, but is it then still the artwork Joost Konijn made? The principle that you respect the integrity of the work. Or we could remove the engine altogether, which makes the car much lighter and much easier to handle. But isn't this too big a step? The principle of minimal intervention. Or shouldn't we keep the option open that the engine will again function in the future? Principle of reversibility of treatment. When I asked why no one in the meeting pleaded for taking out the engine altogether, the answer referred to the professional reticence of conservators and a preference for step-by-step changes. Actually, something beautifully described by Sanneke Stichter in her PhD thesis. This is what Maria Puig de la Bella Casa calls an ethos, a disposition or spirit in which members of the conservation community have learned to work. An ethos that will thoroughly form their perception of the possibilities and constraints of a situation, but cannot beforehand determine what is the best way to proceed. Ethical deliberation is not restricted to a phase before the actual giving or receiving of care, because there is so much judging and decision-making in the doing itself. This emphasis on the doing of care is expressed in Joan Tronto well-known's 4 phases of care. An ethics of care does not only include that need for care is recognized, caring about, or a responsibility assigned, taking care of, but also that care is given and how it is given, and whether and how it is received. These are just as important aspects of care ethical consideration. And the central values good care asks for are attentiveness and responsibility, but also competence and responsiveness. In the doing of care, ethics takes the form of practical tinkering and attentive experimentation, including learning from failures. The ethical is closely connected with the technical and the material, as in the following conversation about how to keep the car on height without activating the engine. Marije, head of collection of Central Museum. What Joost told me on the telephone, he said you could screw off this sphere, part of the hydraulic system, and put in a stick. Rob, the technician, never do this. What happens, this stick takes up all the oil and the stick will start rotting at a certain point. What I do myself, I have a DS in my garage which doesn't write. And then I fetch a broomstick, which I saw into different sizes. Pauline, coordinator of SBMK. So you say, never do this, but you actually do it yourself. Rob, well, it's a car I use for its parts. It will go to the scrapyard. This is not what you should do with an artwork. Maria Puig de la Bella Casa explicitly points to the affective and sensory dimensions of care. Without care, something is plainly repair or maintenance, but it isn't care. When you don't care, it isn't care. These affective dimensions can be positive and negative, and both emotions were present in the meeting. Although the trolley scenario seemed the most viable solution, this step was not easy to make. Marije, head of collections, expressed that she found it very difficult to take leave of the old scenario, with all the energy and carefulness that had gone into it. Lydia, the chair of the meeting, the big step is to realize that it doesn't function anymore. Marije, that has a terrible coldness to it. And that you come twice a year, that's also just, Pauline, you just come twice a year. Here I am, it's in the contract. And where Rob enjoyed the excitement of driving the car, Arthur, collection manager of Central Museum, struggled with the trickiness of the whole operation. Rob, the happening is the driving and that the engine runs, and there's a lot of smoke coming out and crowds of people in the streets. Arthur, yes, Rob, that's nice what you say, but that part exactly is like a boy's adventure book, but I also find that difficult. It's my task to ensure control, and that part feels a bit difficult. These discussions show that values may conflict in concrete situations, and may be a matter of compromise, balancing, and negotiation. That an artwork may have different aspects, and that its conservation might imply that some aspects may be prioritized over others, has been recognized early on. The SBMK decision-making model and its updated Cologne version have been designed just to enable this negotiation. They provide a protocol for the attentive balancing of the importance of these different aspects. But if care ethics focuses on specific local practices, how can we ever go beyond what happens to happen in an individual case? What happens in this negotiation, and reflect on the desirability of the outcomes of such negotiations in terms of a broader good? The answer is thought in terms of comparison. As Jeannette Paul suggests, care ethics should neither try to prescribe values from an external standpoint, nor to remain purely descriptive. It should be rescriptive, looking at how values are shaped in daily life practices and achieving its normativity by comparing these practices. That is what she calls intranormativity. In the platform discussions, comparison was all over. The car was compared with other moving artworks, with old-timers, with pianos, and with bronze sculptures. Solutions found in one case were invoked to be applied to another, as in the following quote, referring to the moving sculptures by Tinguely that often can no longer move. Lydia, who chaired the meetings, when do you put in a new engine and when do you let it go? The idea of a work of art in retirement comes from the Tinguely Museum. Some works have been retired. They may be presented without moving. For other works, a movie is made to be shown next to the non-moving work. There are all kinds of forms in between still living and being written of. On a more encompassing level, you could say that the SBMK platform, as such, is one of the means of the field to exchange experiences by comparing practices. And there are other means, research projects like insight installations, conferences, databases like the Inca database. With a term borrowed from Wyatt and Balmer, I've called this role middle-ranging, going beyond the singular by looking at similarities and differences between cases and finding patterns and contrasts. In 2013, Joan Tronto added a fifth aspect to her list of 4, caring with, aligning care with democratic commitments to justice, equality, and freedom for all, which requires plurality, communication, trust and respect, and solidarity. Although this fifth aspect ultimately addresses care on the level of society as a whole, it's also relevant for discussing the relational dimensions of care on a more restricted level. For example, the loan of Houtauto to Museum de Hallen in Haarlem proved complex, because in getting the car into the museum was a problem. So finally, the car was hoisted to the level of a small window in the building sidewall, and then the car had to drive over a bridge connecting the container with the museum room. This on the level of the first floor. The whole operation took a lot of preliminary research, consultation, and collaboration. An important factor in getting the loan to succeed was the determination and experience of the responsible curator, Susanna, and the trust between the loan giver and the loan taker. Susanna, this has been very laborious, and at one point I thought, I just want this car to come. It was just a matter of honor that it should succeed. The Houtauto is yours, to the Central Museum conservators. You wanted it as much to succeed as we did. Arthur, yes. Susanna, that made it very pleasant. If you have a loan giver who seems hesitant. Marije, I think it was also your experience. You had already managed to get in more big objects here. If you had just started out, you probably would not have dared to do it. So even at this micro level of collaboration, plurality, communication, trust, respect, and solidarity were important in making the loan work. However, these same values are important for the middle-ranging practices of SBMK. You could say that these platform meetings contribute to the ethos of caring with throughout the conservation community. They set the stage for an open discussion in an atmosphere of confidentiality, respect, trust, and solidarity, in which all aspects of the care for work can be addressed from a plurality of perspectives. Okay, but how do we return from the micro level of caring for a particular artwork to the wider world outside conservation? Tronto's fifth phase of care, caring with, refers to society as a whole, which she sees as the outer circle of a series of nested practices. This looks quite like a model that Jill Sterrett showed in her reflections in the conference Reshaping the Collectible, the socio-ecological model of well-being used in healthcare, which is built up as a series of concentric spheres from the individual to the general. And care needs to pay simultaneous attention to all these spheres. The question is how to navigate this environment, how to select relevant areas to work on, as we cannot do everything at once, and how to connect what you do with what others do. How to go forward from the singular case to a wider perspective without excluding what doesn't fit and without losing the uniqueness of the concrete situation, how to look around. Here I would like to draw on Tim Ingold's dwelling perspective to propose a way of relating activities with each other without homogenizing them into an abstract generality. The dwelling perspective sees human and non-human activity and also knowledge as emerging from within. It is because human and non-human beings already live in the world that they can act upon the world and think about it. And the key concept for my purposes is that of the taskscape. Comes closely to the timescape we heard about this afternoon. A taskscape, which is a way of imagining the structuring of this world from within in terms of space and time. Ingold defines task as any practical operation carried out by a skilled agent in an environment as part of his or her normal business of life. Tasks are not carried out in a vacuum, but derive their meaning from their position within an ensemble of tasks, performed in series or in parallel, and usually by many people working together. The concept of a taskscape refers to the entire ensemble of tasks in a mutual interlocking. What relates the numerous activities and tasks is time, not in terms of measurable units in linear succession, but in terms of how we go about in performing these tasks. It is a social time, because people in the performance of their tasks also attend to one another and adjust their movements to each other. The temporality of taskscapes can be best compared to the temporality of music, as a complex interweaving of many concurrent and resonating rhythmic cycles. Defined as qualitative and heterogeneous, rhythmic, complex, and always in movement, the notion of taskscape might be a helpful conceptual tool to bridge the singular and small tasks of caring for artworks and the collaborative tasks for caring for the world we share. So how can the conservation community widen its taskscapes of care? All people forming this community of practice work in different types of institutions, museums, organizations like the Heritage Agency, universities, studios. They're dispersed over a whole number of institutions in a very heterogeneous landscape. And all these institutions urge all of us to do more in less time, attract more students, visitors or clients, acquire prestigious grants, publish more in higher ranked journals, in short, to look ahead rather than around and to compete. Nevertheless, this community has succeeded in maintaining a spirit of collaboration and sharing. That's why I call it a niche. And my suggestion is, from within this niche, look around. Look around deliberately, consistently, and collaboratively, beyond the established museum and university practices, for the cracks where care is needed. And those things happen already. As examples, I would like to mention some initiatives that I just happen to be aware of and that have already been developed or are underway. And what the notion of a taskscape does is providing this imaginative framework that helps us to see these initiatives as somehow resonating, adding to and amplifying each other. For instance, look around for ignored, neglected, or contested artistic cultural legacies. And as an example, I think of the Laikune network that works on artist estates. Use the collective experience the field has with case-based research and collaborative work forms to draw into hitherto under-addressed problems. And the conference, Reshaping the collectible, I think, was a wonderful example of a conference addressing issues as climate change and social injustice, both on a very hands-on and practical level and on a more reflective level. Work together with other fields and groups and do so in an open-ended way, together exploring what the problems might be rather than solving predefined problems. And here a beautiful example was the Art and Nature Conservation Workshop in the Lawrence Center in Leiden. Take the next step in the development of tools like the decision-making model by opening it up for links to wider matters of care. And in all this, keep facilitating and cultivating the attending to one another, to the mutual resonance of movements in what ultimately is the task that binds us all together. And here, quickly, my sources. Again, also here, I'm not alone. My thinking about care has developed together with the thinking and practicing of many dear colleagues in the field of contemporary art conservation, old and young, sometimes in close collaboration, sometimes in more remote forms of resonance. I'm grateful to have been and still be part of this wonderfully open and hospitable intellectual world, and I hope to continue to add something helpful to its ongoing work of caring. IJsbrand Hummelen and Tatja Scholte, you were my mentors and continuous sources of inspiration, and above all, friends. The New Strategy Group was an NWO research project that you have been forming together with others, Vivian van Saase, Annette Dekker, Sanneke Stichter, Hanna Hulling, and many, many others. This has been a warm and enthusiastic think tank over many, many years. My colleagues of the two subsequent projects, Neckar and Naka, early stage researchers and supervisors, and Elaine Simonis, who supported this so wonderfully, thank you. Our summer school and winter schools were memorable events, both intellectually and personally. And I'm happy that so many of you are here. Thanks also to my colleagues from the Restoration Studio Limburg, Schral, the Maastricht Center for Arts, Culture and Cultural Heritage. Thanks to Bonafante, to Jan van Eyck, thanks to SPMK and its wonderful coordinator, Pauline van Hoen. All these collaborations would not have been possible if I hadn't worked for one of the most exciting faculties in the humanities in the Netherlands. Vazels has been my home for almost 30 years. And as all its teaching and research are interdisciplinary, I had the opportunity to work closely with colleagues of all its departments in different constellations over the years. Sometimes it seemed that I changed working place, employer or institution every 5 years because the people I worked with were so different. I have always enjoyed this collaboration immensely. And in spite of some of the sometimes much too heavy work pressure, the spirit of collegiality has always survived. For this, I thank all of you, plus my successive deans and directors. The Department Literature and Art was my home within this home, first under the fatherly wings of Wiel Kusters, later the good care of Lies Wesseling, until I myself became its head of department. I always felt proud of being a member of this most lively and creative group of people. Thank you all, and not in the least for taking over my tasks and responsibilities in the time of my burnout. I'm very happy that Aagje Swinne took over my role as department chair. Teaching at Vazels is very special. I want to thank my students in all the tutor groups, the internships, the thesis supervision, in the master media culture, for all their curiosity and engagement. The PhD candidates I've worked with and I'm still working with. I admire your dedication to your research and your expertise, and both of them have always been a great source of inspiration. I want to thank our eminent support staff. the organization of the faculty is incredibly complex, and our educational structure is even more so. Applause for keeping this machinery running and all the while remaining patient and accessible for scientific staff and students alike. A special thanks to the Secretariat, Geschiedenis, LK, History, Literature and Art, the real engine of our department. There are some colleagues that I want to mention in particular. Lilian Essers, you cannot be here, but I'm sure that my words will reach you. Thank you for watching over me since the very beginning and for being my eyes and my ears during the time that I was department chair. Doris Spijkers and Sophie van Hoonacker, your support and sympathy were a major factor in helping me to recover from my burnout. Jacques Post, I already told you on your own farewell party, thank you for your vision and companionship over all these years. And of course, my partner in crime for so long, Vivian van Sazen. From your prescriptie, there are some people in the audience that still know what that is. Through your internship, by way of your PhD thesis, to the successive research projects that we designed and carried out together, to Naka and Mach, and to the Science and Visual Art course. I have so much enjoyed your collaboration and learned so much from you that I find it impossible to express this in words. I'm glad that there is still a lot of work to do together, because I can hardly imagine not talking to you almost every week about ongoing business and a lot more in between. Your new job at Rijksdienst Cultureel Erfgoed is a very important step, and I'm proud that it is you who will follow in the footsteps of IJsbrand and Tatja, with whom it all started. Dear friends, dear family, thank you for being here and sharing this farewell with me. Some here in the audience, some online. And my final thank you is to this very small, more than human relational web. Now tears come here. Before they were at the Vivian bit, but I rehearsed that. More than the relational web of Renée and Dana. Thank you for your loving presence in my life. Ik heb gezegd.
Thank you. Thank you, Renée, for this extremely inspiring lecture. You told me that you found it vreselijk leuk, which is difficult to translate, but comes down to incredibly nice to prepare for this talk, and it really shows. Thank you so much. Enjoy all your achievements and enjoy today. We will very soon celebrate, and we will do so in the Refter, and I have to tell you some housekeeping things. I'll lower my voice a bit. Housekeeping things. Please move into the Refter. Don't stand in the cold hall, and congratulate Renée. But before we celebrate, before we toast to Renée, I would like, on behalf of Maastricht University, I would like the pedel to come up here and present us with a copy of an engraving of Simon de Bellomonte. So this is an artwork. I mean, it really fits for today. And it is an engraving which was made, it's a copy of an engraving, but was made in around 1570. Can you show us? So very beautiful. And Simon de Bellomonte was een kaarttekenaar, so someone who drew maps. And he was born in 1535 and died in 1615. And what do we see here? We see Maastricht, and on the river Maas, of course, fits to Renée because she's worked here for so long. She lives boven de rivieren, but here we also have a river. And you also see that this is Maastricht as a Roman fortress, as a religious center in the Middle Ages. So Renée, I hope you find a nice place in Amsterdam for this picture. And now we celebrate and toast to Renée van der Vall.